Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics. And 50 years ago, a scandal was exposed. The US president had abused his power to direct the resources of the state against his political opponents for his own political needs. Watergate was so shocking that once exposed, Nixon had no other choice than to resign. 50 years later, the latest Republican president is openly directing the state against his political opponents, and his actions are not only more public, but way more extreme. What changed in those 50 years for the American public to accept such behaviour where once it was universally condemned? But first, for daily news and politics, please click the subscribe button to stay notified. So 1974, helicopters are lifting off the White House lawn. President Nixon waves his final goodbye, and a nation, weary but hopeful, collectively swears never again. Fast forward to 2016 and a reality star candidate storms the stage, defying every political pundit and established norm, wins the presidency, then spends 4 fairly hectic years bulldozing piece by piece every guardrail installed after Watergate. What happened? And even that is nothing compared with what Trump is doing in his second term right now. I mean, do you ever wonder how the reforms that were supposed to save democracy after Nixon, that were designed to prevent another Nixon, actually accidentally greased the poll for Donald Trump? See, if you go back even further to 1964, there was apparently 64% of Americans trusted the federal government to do the right thing. There was a great deal of trust in the government. Today, the number's about 20. People blamed Nixon for the first big drop, for shattering that foundational trust. In response, a determined Congress, with bipartisan resolve, passed a load of ambitious laws. They promised clean campaigns, transparent records, fearless independent journalism. And for a while, those laws seemed to work. They did, until, well, they didn't. The very same rules and restrictions that handcuffed Tricky Dicky, that aimed to curb a future one, any presidential overreach, actually inadvertently weakened political parties and supercharged the influence of outside money. It trained voters to disbelieve everything they hear from official sources and ultimately created the exact populist vacuum that Donald Trump so fluently rode from Trump Tower all the way to the Oval Office. So shall we have a look at how the cure became the disease? So Watergate started, innocuously enough, with a cheap, bungled break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. And it wasn't the break-in itself that brought down the president. It was the systematic cover-up that followed. That cover-up ended up with a bombshell: the president of the United States, on tape, explicitly ordering the CIA to block an FBI investigation. Now, imagine that moment of national revelation. Both political parties, Republicans and Democrats alike, recoiled in horror. The Supreme Court, in a rare display of judicial unity, ruled 8-0 against Nixon, compelling him to release those damning tapes. He, of course, quit before the House could even vote on impeachment, because he was done at that point. Spared the country a deeply divisive spectacle. The mood across the nation was of collective bipartisan horror and an almost moral vow that the presidency would never again become a crime scene. Within a really short time frame, Congress got to work, legislating with that bipartisan energy. There was no tribalism here. They created the Ethics in Government Act, which was designed to mandate financial disclosures for high-ranking officials and prevent conflicts of interest. They established the Congressional Budget Office, which aimed to provide independent analysis and curb executive control over fiscal policy. You know, the FISA Court was born, intended to provide judicial oversight for foreign intelligence surveillance. New campaign finance limits were put in place alongside public financing for presidential campaigns. The hope was to reduce the influence of big money. The Federal Election Commission was created to enforce these new rules. Mandatory financial disclosure became the norm. The Presidential Records Act ensured that presidential documents belonged to the American people, not the president, preventing future cover-ups. And, significantly as well, they established a special prosecutor mechanism, later known as the Independent Counsel Law, meant to insulate investigations of high-level government misconduct from political interference. And you add to this lingering, the the sort of memories of the Saturday Night Massacre when Nixon fired his Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General for refusing to dismiss the special prosecutor, Washington's new religion became oversight, transparency, and an ingrained, healthy suspicion of executive power. Newspapers like the Washington Post won Pulitzers. Their reporters were hailed as heroes. Both parties for a time competed to look holier than thou, eager to prove their commitment to ethical governance. And for the first time since Franklin D. Roosevelt's expansive tenure, the presidency, by specific design, shrank. But here's where the unintended consequences then started to creep in. The post-reform campaign cash rules, whilst well-intentioned, capped big direct donations to political parties. So the idea was to reduce the corrupting influence of large corporate or individual gifts. And you 50 years later, you're thinking, Phil, hang on a minute. That doesn't seem to be the case. But it is, and it isn't. Because what that did was it left private individuals and crucially issue groups relatively free to spend vast sums independently, as long as it wasn't directly coordinated with a campaign. So over time, these soft money loopholes widened, allowing massive unregulated contributions to flow into the political system, into the political debate, through political action committees, PACs, and later super PACs, which could spend unlimited amounts on behalf of candidates. And we've heard about their outsized influence on American politics in recent years, and there are fears about them creeping into British politics. They all started as a genuine intention to reduce political corruption. But the thing about corruption is it's highly motivated to adapt. It doesn't give up. Then the Supreme Court, much more recently in its landmark 2010 Citizens United decision, bulldozed the remaining limits on independent expenditures completely, equating money with free speech. The traditional political parties, starved of direct cash because these laws were still affecting them, and suddenly smothered in a new layer of regulatory red tape, found that they didn't even have control over their own primaries. They had less money to support their favoured candidates, less leverage to enforce party discipline, and less ability to shape their own messages. So there's a political party that has no control over its own party. It created a gaping void. Outsiders, business tycoons with massive fortunes, bombastic talk radio hosts with loyal followings, these days podcasters, grassroots email list organisers, all leapt into the gap, bypassing the traditional party gatekeepers altogether. Donald Trump's 2016 campaign, for example, the Republicans did not want him as their candidate. Famously, it skipped much of the traditional party infrastructure, largely self-funded his primary, dominated news coverage without spending a penny on conventional field officers or party-backed advertising. The very reforms meant to keep big money out of politics by weakening the party's ability to raise and spend, ironically made those parties too poor, too decentralised, and too ineffective to stop a well-funded media-savvy outsider like Trump. Watergate undoubtedly birthed the heroic investigative reporter, cementing the media's role as a vital check on power, but it also inadvertently birthed the 24/7 scandal culture. By the 1990s, every White House story, no matter how minor, seemed to break under banner graphics screaming crisis or scandal. The constant drumbeat of revelations, investigations, accusations, often amplified by the news, began to desensitise the public. Each political side learned to dismiss negative coverage of their own as partisan hit jobs, and to amplify negative coverage of the opposition. When the media, which was once a unified voice against Nixon, became fractured and partisan, trust eroded further. Social media accelerated this distrust exponentially. Platforms like Facebook rewarded outrage and sensationalism. Algorithms shoved voters deeper and deeper into echo chambers where their existing biases were constantly reinforced. So when Trump barks fake news at his critics and the mainstream press, half the country believes him. Why? Because the phrase perfectly captures a simmering feeling that's been building since Nixon's era. Maybe every source is tainted. Maybe every institution has an agenda. The press's Watergate triumph, in its zeal to uncover every transgression, unintentionally trained the public to trust no one, leaving them vulnerable to any leader who claimed to be the only honest voice. The independent counsel statute, born from this urgent desire to insulate prosecutors from political interference, was meant to be a safeguard. Instead, it slowly morphed into a partisan bludgeon. You think about Iran-Contra, Whitewater, Lewinsky, Benghazi, Hillary Clinton's emails, the Russia investigation. Each of those probes, whilst justified in its origins, felt less and less like impartial law enforcement to an increasingly partisan public. It felt more and more like election warfare conducted by other means. The sheer volume and relentless nature of these investigations, often stretching for years, drained millions of taxpayer dollars, dominated news cycles, created a toxic political environment. Voters witnessing this endless cycle absorbed a simple, cynical lesson. Investigators are just another political club wielded by one side against the other. So when President Trump initially fired FBI Director James Comey, an act that many immediately decried as Nixonian in its echoes of the Saturday Night Massacre, Republican voters largely shrugged at that time. The prevailing sentiment seemed to be every president eventually gets a special counsel, right? It's just part of the game now. The reform designed to deter lawlessness by ensuring independent oversight inadvertently normalised its appearance, making continuous high-stakes investigations seem like business as normal rather than a sign of crisis. And now Trump is not content that he fired Comey. He's now directed the Department of Justice to prosecute him. Trump has gone way beyond anything Nixon ever attempted, and he's not even trying to conceal it. He's not even trying to pretend that the charges are independent of him. He wants people to know he's behind them. So then you combine all of these corrosive trends: weakened political parties unable to control their own destiny or articulate a coherent message, a cynical press that much of the public no longer fully trusts, perpetual investigations that feel more like political sport than genuine accountability, and critically, decades of stagnating wages and economic anxiety for vast swathes of the population, which of course creates a sense that the establishment are not looking after people, which was patently true. And what do? You get a giant seething voting bloc that no longer believes any institution, government, media, corporations. They don't believe any of them play fair. They feel forgotten, unheard, actively betrayed by the system, and then enter a candidate who openly says the system is rigged. A candidate who admits, with a wink and a nod, that he gave campaign donations to powerful politicians to buy favours because that's just how the system works. Not my fault. I don't want it to be like that. That's just how it works though, so I'm just playing the game. A candidate who promises loudly and unequivocally to blow it all up, drain the swamp. The post-Watergate reforms were supposed to make insiders more honest, more accountable. Instead, for many, they simply confirmed that insiders were irredeemable, complicit in the very system that had left many of them behind. So why not try the unfiltered, unapologetic guy with the gold escalator, the one who promised to tear down the whole rotten edifice? He certainly wasn't part of the establishment they'd learned to despise, was he? And so in a perverse way, the well-intentioned actions Americans took to defend their democracy half a century ago, against a threat they could all see clearly, actually paved the way for a far greater threat to their democracy. In fact, democracy itself is now imperiled in America. So what's the answer? Well, you can't just not implement defences against corruption for fear that the corrupt will simply adapt to use them for their own advantage. The answer is actually quite old. We just need to remember it. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance. You should never fix a problem then assume it's dealt with forever, especially where corruption is concerned. Be mindful, it will always seek to adapt to the new environment. It will find other ways. You have to constantly review and revise anti-corruption measures. But even well-intentioned politicians are constantly dealing with the urgent problems of the day. And they often don't notice slow-term changes. It's how we ended up in a situation. We've got the mess with, in this country, the Online Safety Act, because it was suddenly realised a few years ago that we have no legislation to govern the online space. The legislation we were using was from the 1980s, where almost nobody had access to the internet and there was no such thing as social media. It crept on us. And the same thing keeps happening here. But the failure to keep reviewing these things is laid clear in America today. The really quite impressive moves made on a bipartisan basis in the 1970s have led to a much greater threat which exists in a hyper-partisan environment because they didn't review it. They didn't consider the impact or how others might be adapting. And you have to wonder just how far Trump has to go now before the country unites against him. But let me know what you think in the comments below. And for more content, you could subscribe to the channel or even join for access to streams and behind the scenes updates. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.